There was a moment, and you know exactly which one, when everything you had built stopped making sense. Not slowly, not with warning, all at once. The job that was supposed to mean something. The version of yourself you had carefully assembled over years of performance and adjustment and quiet self-erasure. The relationships that required you to stay small enough to fit inside someone else's comfort zone. One day, without ceremony, the signal died. What remained was not silence. It was worse than silence. It was static. You kept moving, of course. That is what the programmed self does. It moves even when it no longer knows why. You answered messages. You showed up. You wore the face that people recognized and called by your name. But somewhere beneath the performance, in a frequency too low for anyone around you to detect, something was transmitting a different signal entirely. Something was saying, "This is not it. This has never been it." You have been broadcasting on the wrong channel your entire life. This is where your story actually begins. Not at your birth. Not at your first success or your most celebrated moment. Here, in the static. In the unbearable dissonance between who you were pretending to be and what you were starting, against your own resistance to feel. Pain has a function. Most people never learn this because they spend their entire lives running from it, numbing it, rebranding it as something more acceptable. But pain, in its purest form, is signal. It is the body's most honest transmission. It is the universe pressing its frequency against yours and asking, with no patience for delay, are you going to keep broadcasting this, or are you ready to tune? You were not broken. You were receiving. The static you felt was not the sound of your failure. It was the sound of interference. Two incompatible frequencies attempting to occupy the same channel. The one you had inherited. The one you were beginning to become. They cannot coexist. They never could. The confusion you experienced was not a malfunction. It was the first honest signal your system had produced in years. Consider the radio tower standing in an open field at night. It does not apologize for the signals it cannot carry. It does not pretend to transmit what it was not built to transmit. When the frequency is wrong, the tower does not broadcast anyway and call the noise music. It holds. It waits. It recalibrates. You had been broadcasting music that was never yours to play. The first internal signal arrived quietly. You noticed it in a pause between obligations. A half second of stillness in which you felt, without explanation, that you were watching yourself from a distance. Not dissociation. Something cleaner. Something that had always been present but had never been given enough quiet to be heard. A part of you that was not panicking. A part of you that was simply observing the static and thinking, interesting. The second signal came as physical sensation. A tightness in your chest when you said yes and meant no. A release. Sudden, almost embarrassing in its relief. When you canceled something you had never wanted to attend. Your body had been trying to communicate in its own language for longer than you had been willing to listen. You had mistaken its messages for anxiety, for weakness, for inconvenience. You had medicated them, suppressed them, overridden them with productivity. They were not weakness. They were the most intelligent part of your system running diagnostics. The third signal was a question you could not stop asking. Not out loud. Never out loud. Because the people around you did not have the vocabulary for it, and you were not yet certain you did either. But internally, in the part of yourself that does not perform for anyone. Who am I when no one is watching? What frequency do I carry when I stop trying to match everyone else's? You did not have the answer yet. That is correct. This is episode 1. Answers belong to those who have passed through what you are about to pass through. The ritual for this episode is simple. Tonight, find 3 minutes of genuine stillness. Not meditation as discipline. Not another item on your optimization list. Just 3 minutes in which you do nothing except notice the frequency you are currently carrying. Do not judge it. Do not fix it. Simply observe what signal you have been broadcasting. And ask yourself, once, without needing an answer, is this mine? The static does not last forever. But before the signal clears, it will get louder. Before you find your frequency, you will need to understand how deeply you are tuned to someone else's. The collapse was not the end of your transmission. It was the end of the interference. A system does not reboot while it is still running. This is the part no one tells you. The part that gets omitted from every conversation about transformation, every carefully curated narrative of reinvention. Before the new signal emerges, there must be a period of complete shutdown. Not rest. Not pause. Shutdown. The kind that feels, from the inside, indistinguishable from defeat. You have been in that shutdown. You may still be in it as you receive these words. Good. That means the reboot has already begun. There is a phenomenon in signal processing called a carrier wave. It is the underlying frequency upon which all other information is transmitted. When you listen to a radio station, you are not actually hearing the carrier wave itself. You are hearing what has been encoded upon it. The music, the voices, the news, the noise. All of it rides on top of something deeper, something that was transmitting long before the content arrived and will continue transmitting long after the broadcast ends. You have a carrier wave. You have always had one. The problem was never that your signal was weak. The problem was that it had been so thoroughly encoded with other people's content. Their expectations, their fears, their definitions of who you should be, and what you should want, and how loudly you were permitted to exist, that you could no longer locate the original frequency beneath it. You had mistaken the content for the carrier. You had mistaken the noise for the source. The reboot is not about adding something new. It is about stripping back to what was always there. You woke up differently this morning. Perhaps you cannot explain how. Perhaps the difference was subtle enough that you almost dismissed it. But something had shifted in the quality of your inner atmosphere. The static of the previous episode had not disappeared entirely, but it had changed texture. It was less oppressive, less total. There were moments, brief and luminous, in which you could feel something beneath the noise. Something steady. Something that had not been created by circumstance and therefore could not be destroyed by it. This is the first clear tone. It does not announce itself with drama. Transformation rarely does, despite what the highlight reels suggest. The first clear tone arrives the way dawn arrives, not as an event, but as a gradual shift in the quality of light. You do not see the moment the darkness ends. You simply notice at some point that you can begin to make out shapes. The shapes you are beginning to make out are the contours of your actual self. Not the self that was assembled in response to early wounds. Not the self that learned to perform competence in rooms where vulnerability was penalized. Not the self that contracted itself to fit inside relationships built on the unspoken agreement that you would remain manageable. The self beneath all of that. The carrier wave. The frequency that existed before the encoding began. It is unfamiliar. That is expected. You have spent so long broadcasting other people's content that your own signal feels foreign to you. This is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is finally, after a very long silence, right. The first internal signal came as a moment of unexpected clarity, not about your future. Not yet, the future belongs to later episodes, but about your past. A sudden, almost violent lucidity in which you could see, without the usual protective distortion, exactly how much of your life had been lived in response to other people's frequencies. How many decisions had been made not from your own signal, but from the interference patterns of approval-seeking, fear management, and inherited belief. You did not feel shame about this. You felt something cleaner, something that would eventually reveal itself as the beginning of sovereignty. You felt awake. The second signal arrived as appetite, not hunger for food. Something more precise than that. An appetite for what is real. A sudden intolerance for conversation that stays on the surface, for commitments made from obligation, for the particular exhaustion of performing a version of yourself that requires constant maintenance. Something in you had stopped being willing to spend its energy on the upkeep of a signal that was never truly yours. This refusal was not arrogance. It was the first honest transmission your system had produced in the direction of your actual life. The third signal was silence chosen deliberately. At some point in the last cycle, you sought stillness not because you were exhausted, but because you were curious. You wanted to hear what was underneath. You sat with yourself, perhaps only for minutes, perhaps longer. And you did not immediately fill the space with content. This was new. This was significant. The willingness to be present with your own frequency without immediately encoding it with distraction is one of the rarest capacities a human being can develop. You are developing it. The reboot requires one conscious act of realignment per day. Not a complete overhaul, not a dramatic severance from your previous life. One act. Something small enough to be sustainable and true enough to be meaningful. It might be a conversation you stop having because it drains your signal. It might be a morning practice of 3 minutes, extending the ritual from the last episode, in which you locate your carrier wave before the day's content begins to layer itself on top of it. The ritual for this episode is this: before you speak your first words of the day to anyone else, speak one sentence to yourself. Not an affirmation borrowed from someone else's frequency. Your own sentence. Something that is true about who you are becoming. You do not need to believe it fully yet. You only need to transmit it once cleanly into the silence of your own inner atmosphere. Say it like you mean it. The body does not distinguish between performance and truth. It responds to signal regardless of whether you have caught up cognitively. Transmit the sentence. Let the carrier wave receive it. A reboot does not return the system to its previous state. That is the misunderstanding most people carry into transformation. The hope that once the difficulty passes, they will return to a familiar version of themselves, just slightly improved. This is not what happens. This is not what is supposed to happen. A reboot returns the system to its original state, to the frequency beneath all the encoding, to the carrier wave that was present before the world began transmitting its content through you. You are not going back to who you were. You are going forward to who you always were. The system is coming online. But coming online means nothing without the development of the one capacity that will change everything that follows. The capacity to observe your own signal without being consumed by it. That development begins in the next transmission. There is a part of you that has never been confused. Sit with that for a moment before moving forward. Let it land in the place where you carry your most persistent doubts, your longest-running uncertainties, the quiet conviction that you are somehow fundamentally flawed in a way that others are not. Let it land there and displace, even briefly, the static that is accumulated in that space. There is a part of you that has never been confused. It has watched the confusion. It has witnessed the collapse, the reboot, the slow and disorienting process of life rearranging itself around a truer frequency. But it has not been confused. It has not been afraid. It has not, even in your darkest transmissions, gone offline. You are about to meet it properly for the first time. In 1909, a physicist named Geoffrey Taylor conducted an experiment that would quietly fracture the foundations of everything humanity thought it understood about the nature of reality. He fired individual photons, single particles of light, the smallest possible units of electromagnetic transmission, through a barrier containing 2 narrow slits. What he expected to find was simple. A particle goes through one slit or the other. What he found instead was impossible by every prior understanding. The single photon, with no other particles to interact with, produced an interference pattern on the other side, as though it had passed through both slits simultaneously, as though the act of not being watched had allowed it to exist in multiple states at once. Then the observers arrived, when scientists placed a measuring device at the slits. When they introduced the act of watching, the photon collapsed. It chose a single path. It became definite. It became one thing instead of many. Observation collapses infinite possibility into singular reality. You are the observer, and you have been leaving yourself unwatched for far too long. Here is what happens when a human being moves through their life without developing the observer function. They become identical to their signal. They cannot distinguish between the frequency they are carrying and the self that is carrying it. When the signal is disturbed, when fear arrives, or grief, or the particular vertigo of not knowing who you are anymore, they experience it not as weather passing through their atmosphere, but as the atmosphere itself. They do not have fear. They become fear. They do not experience confusion. They become confused, entirely, with no remainder. This is the condition you are moving out of. The observer is not a concept. It is not a spiritual luxury available only to those with sufficient leisure for contemplation. It is a neurological reality. What researchers in consciousness studies call metacognition, the mind's capacity to observe its own processes, to hold its own states as objects of awareness rather than as the totality of experience. It is the difference between a radio tower that is destroyed by every storm and a radio tower that watches storms move through the landscape it inhabits. The tower does not become the storm. The tower transmits through it. You notice the observer for the first time not in a moment of peace, but in a moment of intensity. This is how it almost always happens. The witness frequency does not announce itself during calm. It announces itself during turbulence, because turbulence is when the contrast becomes visible. You are in the middle of something difficult. A conversation that was pulling your signal into old patterns. An emotional state that was threatening to become total. A moment in which the programmed self was reaching for its familiar responses. And then, without effort, without technique, something stepped back. Not away. Back. A millimeter of inner distance opened between you and what you were experiencing. Just enough space to think, I am watching myself right now. Just enough space for the photon to pass through both slits before collapsing into a single, chosen response. That millimeter is everything. That millimeter is the difference between a life that happens to you and a life that you architect. This was the first internal signal. The unexpected appearance of inner distance during a moment that previously would have consumed you entirely. You did not manufacture it. You could not have. The observer cannot be forced into existence by the very mind it is meant to observe. It emerged because your system had been preparing for it since the collapse began, since the static, since the reboot. All of that disruption was not punishment. It was excavation. It was the clearing of enough internal space for the witness to finally have room to stand. The second signal was the quality of your attention shifting. You began to notice not just what you were thinking, but the fact that you were thinking it. A subtle but seismic difference. Thoughts that previously arrived with the full force of absolute truth began to arrive as transmissions. Information moving through the system. Worthy of observation, not automatically worthy of belief. You started catching yourself mid-pattern, mid-reaction, mid-performance of the old frequency. And in the catching, something remarkable occurred. The pattern lost momentum. Not because you fought it. Because you saw it. Because the observer, simply by observing, begins to change what is observed. The double-slit experiment lived from the inside. The third signal was compassion without collapse. Someone in your life transmitted pain in your direction, deliberately or otherwise, and for the first time you were able to receive it without either absorbing it entirely or armoring against it entirely. The observer held the space between. You could feel the impact of what was transmitted without losing the signal of who you are beneath it. You could be present with another person's frequency without becoming it. This is not detachment. This is the opposite of detachment. This is the capacity to be fully present with another human being while remaining fully present with yourself simultaneously. This is what genuine connection requires. This is what you are becoming capable of. The observer does not judge what it sees. This is critical, and it must be stated clearly because the mind in its early attempts at self-observation will almost immediately recruit the observer function into the service of self-criticism. It will use the new capacity for inner seeing to generate a more sophisticated catalog of everything that is wrong with you. This is the programmed self's most elegant defense mechanism. It co-opts the tools of liberation and puts them to work maintaining the prison. When you notice yourself using observation as a vehicle for self-attack, do not fight it. Observe that too. The observer observes the observer being misused. There is always another layer of witness available. You cannot fall out of awareness. You can only forget temporarily that you are in it. The ritual for this episode: 3 times today, at moments of your choosing, pause for exactly 10 seconds and ask internally, what frequency am I currently transmitting? Not what are you thinking, not what are you feeling. What are you transmitting? What signal is currently moving outward from you into the space you inhabit? Notice it without changing it. The act of noticing is sufficient. The observer does not need to intervene. It only needs to see. 10 seconds. 3 times. Let the witness frequency strengthen through use. You have now established something that cannot be taken from you. Not a belief system. Not a philosophy. A function. A living operational capacity within your own consciousness that exists independently of your circumstances, your mood, your history, your current level of certainty about anything. The observer is online. It will deepen through every episode that follows. It will become, by the end of this series, the primary lens through which you experience your own existence. But before the observer can fully operate, it must face its most disorienting discovery. It must learn that what it has been observing, the self it thought it was, is not singular. There are voices inside you that do not belong to you. There are frequencies running in your system that were installed long before you had any say in the matter. And until you can separate them from your own signal, you cannot know what you are actually transmitting. That separation begins in the next episode, and it will be the most unsettling and liberating transmission of your life. You are not the only one transmitting inside you. This is not a metaphor offered for poetic effect. This is a precise description of your neurological and psychological reality, and the sooner you receive it with the full weight of its implications, the sooner you can begin to do something about it. Inside the system you call yourself, there are multiple frequencies running simultaneously. Some of them are yours, many of them are not, and until this moment, until the observer was sufficiently developed to make this kind of examination possible, you had no reliable way to tell the difference. You have been living inside a crowded broadcast tower, transmitting signals you never chose, speaking in voices that were handed to you before you were old enough to question their origin, moving through the world carrying frequencies that belong to people who are not you, situations that no longer exist, wounds that were never yours to carry in the first place. Today, the separation begins. In radio engineering, there is a process called signal isolation. When a transmission is corrupted, when the intended broadcast has been contaminated by external interference, by ghost signals bleeding in from adjacent frequencies, by the accumulated noise of a system that has been running without calibration for too long, the engineer does not attempt to fix the signal while the interference is still present. The first step is always isolation. Identify the original transmission. Separate it from everything that has attached itself to it. Hold the pure signal apart from the noise long enough to understand what the signal actually is. Only then can the broadcast be restored. You are about to conduct your first act of signal isolation. Think of the voice that speaks when you are about to take a risk. The one that arrives precisely at the moment of potential expansion. When you are close to saying something true, attempting something new, reaching toward a version of your life that exceeds the boundaries of what has previously been permitted. You know this voice. You have heard it so many times across so many thresholds that you have likely begun to mistake it for wisdom, for discernment, for the reasonable, protective counsel of a self that has learned from experience. Listen to it more carefully now through the lens of the observer you have been developing. Notice its tone. Notice the particular quality of its certainty. Notice how it arrives not as a question but as a verdict. Notice how it speaks in absolutes. You can't, you won't, you never have. Who do you think you are? And how those absolutes have a texture that is oddly familiar. Familiar not because they are true. Familiar because you have heard them before. In a specific room. In a specific voice. From a specific person who at a specific moment in your formation transmitted their own fear directly into your developing signal. You absorbed it. You had no choice. You were not yet equipped with the observer function, not yet capable of signal isolation, not yet able to say, "This transmission is not mine. I am not required to carry it forward." But you are equipped now. The voices running inside you can be organized, roughly, into 3 categories of transmission. The first are inherited frequencies. The beliefs, limitations, emotional patterns, and identity definitions that were transmitted to you by your family of origin. These are the oldest signals in your system. They were encoded before language, in some cases, transmitted through atmosphere and nervous system, and the wordless communication of early attachment. They feel like bedrock because they were laid down first. But bedrock is not the same as truth. A foundation can be built on soil that does not belong to the structure it supports. The second are conditioned frequencies. The signals you developed in response to your environment over time. Every time you contracted yourself to avoid conflict, you encoded a frequency that said, smallness is safety. Every time you were rewarded for a performance rather than for your authentic transmission, you encoded a frequency that said, the performance is what has value, the real signal underneath it does not. These frequencies are not inherited. They are adaptive. They were genuinely useful once. They kept you safe in systems that could not accommodate your full signal. The problem is that adaptive frequencies do not dissolve automatically when the environment changes. They continue transmitting long after their function has ended. The third are resonant frequencies. The signals you absorbed from prolonged exposure to other people's emotional states. Anxiety is perhaps the most contagious frequency in human transmission. Spend enough years in close proximity to someone whose nervous system is broadcasting constant threat, and your own nervous system begins to mirror the pattern. You may have no memory of learning to be afraid. You may experience your anxiety as simply part of who you are. It is not. It is a resonant frequency. It entered your system through proximity, not through truth. The first internal signal was the recognition of a borrowed voice. At some point in the last cycle, you caught a familiar internal statement. One of those automatic verdicts about what you are or are not capable of. And for the first time, you did not simply receive it as fact. You paused. You held it up to the light of observation. And you noticed, with a clarity that was equal parts liberating and disorienting, that the voice delivering it did not sound like you. It sounded like someone else. Someone specific. Someone whose fear had been so present in your formation that you had absorbed their signal without ever being asked whether you consented to carry it. You did not have to name the person out loud. The recognition was sufficient. The second signal was a moment of frequency mismatch. You were in a situation, a conversation, a decision, a moment of social navigation. And you noticed two distinct transmissions running simultaneously inside you. One was familiar, automatic, already moving toward the habitual response. The other was quieter, slower, more uncertain but more honest. The second signal was yours. You could feel the difference not as a thought but as a physical sensation. A subtle but unmistakable distinction in the quality of energy each transmission carried in your body. The inherited voice was tight, urgent, slightly pressured. Your actual signal was open, unhurried, present. You chose the familiar one this time. That is correct. You are not yet expected to always choose the authentic signal. You are only expected, at this stage, to be able to tell them apart. The third signal was grief without a clear object. Somewhere in the process of beginning to identify the frequencies that are not yours, you encountered an unexpected emotional transmission, a sadness that had no immediate cause. This is common at this stage of the work, and it is important to receive it correctly. The grief is not about loss of the false self. Though that separation is genuinely occurring, the grief is older than that. It is the grief of having carried a weight for so long, of having organized your entire identity around signals that were never truly yours, of the years spent broadcasting on the wrong frequency and not knowing there was another option. Let it transmit fully. Do not encode it with shame or with the pressure to move past it quickly. Grief that is allowed to complete its transmission does not return as static. Grief that is suppressed becomes interference. The ritual for this episode: take a single belief you hold about yourself, one that limits you, one that has been present for as long as you can remember, and ask it one question: whose voice is this in? Not what does this belief mean, not whether it is true or false. Simply, whose voice is it in? Hear it again internally and listen for the accent of its origin. You may not receive an immediate answer. The answer is not the point. The question is the point. The question is the act of signal isolation. The question creates the separation. Write the belief down if you are willing. Right next to it: this transmission entered my system on a date I did not choose. I am now choosing what to do with it. The separation is not an act of violence against your history. You are not cutting away parts of yourself. You are not declaring war on the people whose frequencies you absorbed. You are simply, for the first time, with full consciousness, sorting the signal from the noise. What is yours you keep. You develop it. You amplify it. You broadcast it with increasing clarity and increasing courage as this series progresses. What is not yours, you do not delete. You cannot delete a frequency that was encoded at the neurological level. But you can stop amplifying it. You can reduce its gain. You can, through the sustained practice of observation and conscious choice, gradually retune your system until the inherited static is no longer louder than your actual signal. This process requires something you have not yet fully accessed. It requires the one environment in which the authentic frequency becomes audible above everything else. It requires silence, not the silence of avoidance, not the silence of emptiness, the silence of a signal so clear it needs no amplification. That silence is where the next episode takes you. You have been afraid of silence your entire life, not because silence is dangerous, because silence is honest. Because in the absence of noise, external noise, internal noise, the constant low-grade broadcast of distraction and obligation, and the performance of being a person with somewhere to be and something to do, what remains is the signal you have been avoiding. The one that knows. The one that has always known. The one that cannot be argued with, medicated into manageability, or buried beneath sufficient busyness. Silence does not create that signal. Silence reveals it. This is why you have filled every available frequency with content. This is why the first instinct when stillness begins to descend is to reach for the phone, the noise, the next obligation, the conversation that does not need to happen but conveniently fills the space where truth would otherwise become audible. You were not lazy. You were not undisciplined. You were managing a very sophisticated avoidance of the one encounter that changes everything. The encounter with your own unmediated frequency. That encounter is no longer avoidable. You have arrived at the silence, and it is time to stop treating it as an absence and begin understanding it as the most precise transmission available to you. In physics, there is a concept called the zero-point field. It is the irreducible baseline of energy that exists in a given space even when all other energy has been removed. Even at absolute zero, even in conditions of total apparent emptiness, the field persists. Physicists initially expected to find nothing at the bottom of all things. What they found instead was a vast, dynamic, inexhaustible field of potential energy, humming beneath every observable phenomenon in the universe. The silence beneath the signal. The frequency beneath all frequencies. You have one. At the base of your consciousness, beneath the inherited voices and the conditioned responses and the resonant frequencies absorbed from decades of proximity to other people's fears, there is a field. It is not loud. It was never designed to compete with noise. It does not announce itself with urgency or with the particular insistence of the programmed self, which has learned that loudness is the price of being heard. It simply persists. Steady. Inexhaustible. Present in the way that the zero-point field is present. Not as a thing among other things, but as the ground beneath all things. When you enter genuine silence, you touch this field. And once you have touched it, you cannot unfeel it. The silence you are being asked to enter is not the silence of an empty room. External silence is useful. It reduces the incoming signal load and makes internal observation easier. But it is not the silence being described here. You can be in a completely quiet room and generate more internal noise than a crowded marketplace. You can be in the center of a city and carry within you an inner stillness that nothing in the external environment can disturb. The silence being described here is interior architecture. It is the deliberate cessation of self-generated interference. It is the practice of not adding your own commentary to the present moment, not analyzing it, not narrating it, not immediately encoding it with meaning and implication and projection about what it signifies for your future, simply receiving it. Simply being the observer, without the observer adding its own noise to what it observes. This is the hardest thing a human being can learn to do. It is also the most powerful. There is a specific quality of intelligence that only becomes accessible in silence. Not the intelligence of analysis. That operates perfectly well amid noise, perhaps better amid noise, since analysis thrives on content to analyze. A different intelligence. One that does not work through logic or sequential reasoning, but through something more direct. Something that arrives not as a thought constructed step by step, but as a knowing that is simply present, complete, requiring no assembly. You have experienced this intelligence. You called it intuition, and then, because the culture you were raised in had no reliable framework for honoring non-analytical knowing, you second-guessed it. You ran it through the approval mechanism of rational justification. You waited until you could explain it before you trusted it. And in the gap between the knowing and the explanation, the moment frequently passed, the decision was made by default rather than by signal. And you were left with the faint but persistent sense that you had overridden something important. That intelligence lives in the zero-point field. It transmits in silence. It cannot be forced. It cannot be demanded. It can only be received by a system that has been sufficiently stilled to detect a signal that does not compete for attention. The first internal signal came as an unexpected answer. You had been carrying a question. Not necessarily consciously, perhaps only as a low-grade, unresolved tension in your system. And during a moment of unplanned stillness, without effort, without the machinery of deliberate problem-solving, the answer arrived. Not dramatically. It did not arrive with fanfare or with the particular electricity of epiphany. It arrived the way a shape becomes visible as your eyes adjust to low light, gradually. Then all at once, and once visible, it was obvious. So obvious that your first response was not wonder, but a quiet, almost embarrassed recognition. I have known this for a long time. You have known many things for a long time that you have not been still enough to hear. The second signal was the body's response to genuine silence. When you allowed yourself to stop, to genuinely stop rather than to pause between activities, something in your physical system began to release. Not all at once. The body, like the mind, has learned to maintain a certain baseline of tension as a protective strategy, and it does not relinquish that tension immediately simply because the threat has passed. But layer by layer, in the presence of sustained stillness, something began to let go. Shoulders that had been carrying invisible weight. A jaw that had been held against something that happened years ago. A chest that had been bracing against a future that had not arrived and might never arrive. The body, in silence, begins to remember that it is safe to be itself. This is significant beyond comfort. A body held in chronic tension is a body broadcasting a chronic distress signal. Every interaction you have, every transmission you send into your environment, carries the frequency of that tension. When the body releases in silence, the quality of your transmission changes. You begin to broadcast from a calmer, cleaner, more coherent signal. People feel this before they can name it. They feel drawn toward you without knowing why. They feel steadied by your presence. They feel in your vicinity that something reliable is transmitting. This is the beginning of what will later become your most profound form of influence. The third signal was the disappearance of the question. There is a particular kind of silence that arrives not as the absence of answers, but as the dissolution of the need for them. You touched this briefly, perhaps only for seconds, perhaps longer. A state in which the relentless forward momentum of the seeking mind simply paused, in which the perpetual project of becoming temporarily released its urgency, in which you were not on your way to anywhere, not working toward anything, not behind on anything, simply present, simply the frequency, resting in its own field, simply the observer, with nothing to observe and no need for anything to change. This is not complacency. Do not make that error. The stillness of the 0-point field is not the stillness of stagnation. It is the stillness of immense potential before it becomes kinetic. It is the silence before the broadcast, the held breath before the first clear tone. Everything that follows in this series emerges from the silence. Every act of reprogramming, every expansion of consciousness, every elevation of identity. All of it draws its energy from the field you touch when you stop adding noise to the frequency you carry. 10 minutes, not 3. The work has deepened, and so the practice deepens with it. 10 minutes of silence that is not used for anything, not for problem solving, not for visualization, not for the rehearsal of future conversations or the review of past ones. 10 minutes in which the only instruction is to notice when you are generating internal noise, commentary, narration, analysis, judgment, and to gently, without self-criticism, cease the generation. You will not achieve 10 minutes of genuine inner stillness. That is not the point. The point is the repeated act of returning. Each time you notice the noise has resumed and you choose again to release it, you are strengthening the most important muscle in your entire system, the muscle of conscious return. The ability to come back to your own frequency after interference. You will need this muscle for everything that follows. The silence has shown you the field. It has given you a direct experience of the frequency beneath all frequencies. The 0 point of your own consciousness. The irreducible signal that persists beneath every layer of noise, every inherited voice, every conditioned response. Now comes the question that silence always eventually generates. If this is who I actually am, if this field, this carrier wave, this steady and inexhaustible frequency is the truth of my identity, then what am I still doing broadcasting the old signal? What remains of the programmed self must now be examined, understood, and consciously integrated, not destroyed, not suppressed, brought into coherence with the frequency you have discovered at your core. The integration does not begin gently. It begins with the parts of yourself you have most carefully avoided. There is a part of you that you have never introduced to the rest of yourself. You know which part. You have always known. It is the one you learned early and efficiently to keep off the air. The one whose frequency was met at some critical moment of your formation with a response that communicated clearly and without appeal. This transmission is not welcome here. Perhaps it was the part that felt too much. Perhaps it was the part that wanted too much, reached too far, dreamed at a scale that made the people around you uncomfortable in ways they expressed as concern but functioned as containment. Perhaps it was the part that was angry, or grieving, or afraid in ways that exceeded the emotional bandwidth of the systems you were raised inside. Whatever it was, you learned to mute it. You learned to route your broadcast around it. You built an identity. A functional, presentable, largely coherent identity, with that frequency conspicuously absent from the transmission. And the missing frequency has been creating interference ever since. In signal theory, a suppressed frequency does not disappear. This is the fundamental misunderstanding that underlies a lifetime of avoidance. When you attempt to remove a frequency from a transmission, when you push it below the threshold of conscious broadcast, it does not cease to exist. It continues operating in the lower registers of the system, outside conscious awareness, shaping the output in ways that cannot be predicted or controlled precisely because they cannot be observed. Engineers call this a ghost signal. It is present in the broadcast without being visible in the transmission. It creates distortion in frequencies it was never intended to touch. It introduces a faint but persistent wrongness into signals that should be clean. Your ghost signals have been distorting your broadcast for years. The anger you never fully expressed has been shaping your relationships in ways that look like withdrawal or over-control, or the particular brittleness of someone who is managing too much internal pressure. The grief you bypassed has been creating a low-frequency sadness that colors everything slightly darker than it needs to be. The desire you learned to be ashamed of has been generating a restlessness that nothing external has ever quite been able to satisfy, because the restlessness is not about the external. It is about a frequency that has never been permitted to fully transmit. Integration is not therapy. It is engineering. It is the precise and deliberate process of bringing the ghost signals back into the conscious broadcast so that the full transmission becomes coherent. Coherence is a specific term in physics, and it deserves your full attention here. When waves are coherent, they are synchronized. Their frequencies align, their peaks and troughs move in relationship, rather than in opposition. Coherent light, such as a laser, can cut through steel. Incoherent light, such as a standard bulb, disperses in every direction and cannot focus its energy into anything more than general illumination. The difference in power between these two is not a difference in the amount of energy available. It is a difference in coherence. You have been broadcasting as incoherent light your entire life, not because your signal is weak, because your signal is divided against itself. Because the frequencies you have suppressed are running in opposition to the frequencies you have permitted, creating an internal interference pattern that disperses your energy in every direction simultaneously. This is why you have sometimes felt exhausted by your own life, why genuine rest has been elusive, why you have poured enormous energy into endeavors that should have been generative and found yourself depleted rather than replenished. You were not failing. You were incoherent. You were a laser trying to function with its beam divided. Integration creates coherence. Integration aligns the frequencies. And coherent transmission does not require more energy. It requires less. It requires only that all parts of the signal are moving in the same direction. The first internal signal was an unexpected encounter with a suppressed frequency. It did not announce itself politely. Suppressed frequencies rarely do. They have been waiting too long for patience. It arrived as a disproportionate reaction, an emotional response whose intensity exceeded what the immediate situation seemed to warrant. A flash of anger at something minor, a wave of grief triggered by something tangential, a sudden, almost overwhelming surge of longing with no clear object. These disproportionate responses are not malfunctions. They are the ghost signals breaking through the surface of the broadcast, demanding finally to be heard, insisting on their right to exist in the transmission. The observer, properly deployed, does not run from this moment. The observer watches it. The observer says, something is trying to complete its transmission. Something has been waiting for permission to be fully felt. And then the observer does the most courageous thing available to a human consciousness at this stage of development. It gives that permission. The second signal was the discovery of energy on the other side of a suppressed frequency. You allowed something to fully transmit. A feeling, a truth, an aspect of yourself that had been held below the threshold of conscious broadcast. And what followed the transmission was not the devastation you had been unconsciously expecting. What followed was space. A quality of internal spaciousness that had not been available before, because that part of the system had been using energy to maintain the suppression. The moment the suppression was released, the energy it had been consuming became available for other transmissions. This is the counterintuitive physics of emotional integration. The feeling you are most afraid to feel is the one costing you the most energy to avoid. The grief you bypass does not save you from its weight. It transfers the weight from your emotional system to your energetic one, where it runs as a constant drain on your capacity to transmit clearly. Feel it. Transmit it fully. Recover the energy. The third signal was a moment of unexpected self-recognition. In the process of allowing a suppressed frequency to surface, you caught a glimpse of something that had been hidden behind it. A quality, a capacity, a dimension of your signal that the suppression had been obscuring. The anger, when allowed to complete its transmission, revealed beneath it a fierce and clarifying sense of what you will no longer accept in your life. The grief, when fully felt, revealed beneath it a depth of love and caring that the numbness of avoidance had been masking. The desire, when acknowledged without shame, revealed beneath it a vision of your life at full signal. Expansive, alive, radiantly specific in its direction. Every suppressed frequency has a gift on its other side. The gift is always some version of your actual power. Integration does not mean indulgence. This distinction matters, and it must be made clearly. You are not being invited to broadcast every suppressed frequency in every available direction, without regard for context or consequence. A laser does not point itself randomly. Coherence is not chaos. The integration being described here is internal. It is the process of allowing all parts of your signal to exist consciously within your own system, to be acknowledged by the observer, to complete their transmission in the contained space of your own awareness. What you do with the integrated frequency, when and where and how you choose to broadcast it externally, remains entirely within your sovereign authority. And that sovereignty, as will become clear in the episodes ahead, is precisely what integration makes possible. You cannot operate from genuine internal authority while parts of your own signal are running below your awareness, outside your conscious control, shaping your output without your knowledge or consent. Integration is the prerequisite for sovereignty. You cannot govern a territory you have not fully explored. Identify one suppressed frequency, one emotional truth, one aspect of yourself you have kept off the air, and give it 3 minutes of uninterrupted transmission within the privacy of your own awareness. Not expression to another person, not journaling, not analysis, simply internal permission. Simply the observer holding the space while the frequency completes what it has been trying to complete. If the frequency arrives with physical sensation, tightness, heat, pressure, the specific weight of long-held grief, breathe into the sensation rather than away from it. The body is the antenna through which suppressed frequencies finally transmit. Let it do its work. Afterward, notice what is present in the space where the suppression was. Notice the quality of energy available there now. Write one word for what you find. Just one. Keep it. You are becoming coherent. Not perfect. Coherence is not perfection. Coherence is alignment. It is the condition in which all parts of your signal are moving in relationship with each other. None suppressed. None running as ghost interference below the threshold of your awareness. You are not there yet. This is episode 6 of 15. And the work deepens considerably from here. But you have begun the process that makes everything else possible. The ghost signals are surfacing. The divided transmission is beginning to align. The laser is finding its focus. The focus signal, coherently transmitted, can do something that dispersed light never could. It can cut through the programming. The reprogramming begins in the next episode. And it is not gentle. It is not slow. It will require every capacity you have developed across the preceding 5 transmissions. You are ready. The coherence you have begun to establish is precisely what makes the next phase survivable and transformative. Every frequency you carry was written somewhere. This is not poetry. This is the operational reality of how a human nervous system develops, how identity is encoded, how the patterns that govern your behavior, your automatic responses, your default emotional settings, your unconscious assumptions about what is possible for you and what is not, were installed in your system before you had any meaningful capacity to evaluate them. You did not choose your original programming. No one does. You were handed a frequency and told, implicitly and explicitly and relentlessly, that it was you. It was never you. It was a first draft, written by people who were themselves working from first drafts handed to them by people who never questioned theirs. The reprogramming is not a rejection of your history. It is the first act of genuine authorship in your life. Neuroplasticity is one of the most significant scientific discoveries of the last century, and it remains one of the most underutilized in the project of human transformation. For most of recorded history, The brain was understood as a fixed structure, a system whose architecture was established in early development and thereafter remained essentially static. You were who you were. The patterns laid down in childhood were the patterns you carried to your grave, perhaps softened by experience, perhaps expressed differently across different contexts, but fundamentally unchanged in their deep structure. This understanding was wrong. Here is what reprogramming actually requires, stated without the comfortable vagueness that surrounds most conversations about change. It requires three things simultaneously, and the absence of any one of them reduces the process to surface adjustment rather than genuine transformation. It requires precise identification of the pattern being reprogrammed. Not a general sense that something is wrong, not a vague desire to be different, but a specific observer-level clarity about the exact frequency, its trigger conditions, its behavioral expression, and the belief about identity that it encodes. You cannot rewrite code you have not read. It requires repetition of the replacement frequency. Not once, not in a single dramatic moment of resolution, but across time, across contexts, across the full range of situations in which the old pattern has historically operated. A new neural pathway is not carved by intention. It is carved by use. The new frequency must be transmitted repeatedly, particularly in the conditions that most powerfully activate the old one, for the new pathway to develop sufficient depth to compete with the established groove. And it requires identity-level reframing, the most demanding of the three and the most essential. Because a pattern that has been installed as identity cannot be removed by behavior modification alone. If the old frequency carries the implicit message, "This is who I am," then the new frequency must carry an equally clear counter-transmission. "This is who I am becoming," not as aspiration, as declaration, as a signal transmitted with the full authority of the observer who has seen through the programming and chosen, consciously, to write something different. The first internal signal was the moment of pattern recognition mid-execution. You were running an old program, an automatic response, a habitual transmission that you have enacted hundreds or thousands of times, and the observer caught it, not afterward, in the reflective space of retrospect where it is easy to see clearly, during. Mid-pattern, mid-transmission, the observer stepped into the signal stream while it was still flowing and said, "I see this. I know what this is. I know where this goes." And for a fraction of a second, the pattern lost its automaticity. That fraction of a second is the entire opening. That is where the reprogramming enters. Not in grand gestures or dramatic renunciations, but in that hairline gap between stimulus and response, between trigger and transmission, between the old groove and the new path that is being carved through the patient and courageous practice of choosing differently. The second signal was physical discomfort in the act of choosing the new frequency. When you transmitted the new signal, when you responded differently than the old program dictated, when you said the true thing instead of the managed thing, when you held your ground instead of collapsing into the familiar accommodation, your body registered the deviation as threat, a spike of anxiety, a wave of the particular nausea that accompanies genuine risk, a strong, almost gravitational pull back toward the old groove, because the old groove is known and the new path is not. And the nervous system, in its fundamental conservatism, consistently votes for the known over the unknown regardless of whether the known is good for you. This discomfort is not a signal to stop. It is a signal that the reprogramming is real. It is the sensation of a new pathway being carved. It is neuroplasticity felt from the inside. It is supposed to be uncomfortable. It means something is actually changing. The third signal was a moment of transmission from the new identity. Brief. Perhaps only seconds long. But real. A moment in which you were not performing the new frequency, not effortfully choosing it against the resistance of the old groove, but simply transmitting it, naturally, without the friction of deliberate override. As though, for that moment, it was simply what you were, as though the new pathway had, in that instant, become the path of least resistance. This is what you are building toward, not the endless effortful maintenance of chosen responses. The gradual, neurologically real transformation of your default transmission. The reprogramming is working. The evidence is in the moments, however brief, when the new frequency arrives without being summoned. Select one specific pattern, one automatic transmission that you have identified clearly enough to name, and design its replacement frequency, not vaguely, specifically.
If the old pattern is automatic withdrawal when confronted with conflict, the replacement frequency is not simply be more open. That is aspiration without architecture. The replacement frequency is a specific behavior, a specific transmission, a specific thing you will do or say or choose in the precise moment when the old trigger fires. Write the replacement frequency as a statement beginning with, "When I now transmit." Read it 3 times. Not for memorization, for encoding. You are writing new source code. Treat it with the precision that ACT deserves.
The reprogramming will not be complete by the end of this episode. It will not be complete by the end of this series. Genuine neural reprogramming is measured in months and years, not episodes. But something has shifted that cannot be undone. The patterns are no longer invisible. The programming is no longer mistaken for identity. The observer is watching the source code run, and the observer has begun, with increasing skill and increasing authority, to rewrite it. You are no longer a receiver of frequencies handed to you by history. You are becoming a transmitter of frequencies chosen by design. But transmission without direction is still noise. The reprogrammed signal needs somewhere to go. It needs to be focused, aimed, applied with precision in the landscape of your daily life. That precision is called conscious operation, and it begins in the next episode, where everything you have built across the first 7 transmissions is finally put to work. You have spent most of your life transmitting unconsciously, not carelessly. You have been enormously careful, not thoughtlessly. You have thought, perhaps more than is healthy, about every word spoken and unspoken, every impression created, every signal sent into the social atmosphere around you. But all of that care, all of that thought, has been in service of managing the broadcast, rather than directing it. You have been monitoring the transmission for acceptable output, rather than consciously choosing what to transmit in the first place. There is a difference between a broadcast that is managed and a broadcast that is intentional. The managed broadcast is reactive. It responds to incoming signals, adjusts for audience, modulates for approval, contracts and expands based on the perceived safety of the environment. It is sophisticated. It is exhausting. And it is, at its core, still operating from the old programming, still organized around the question of what will be acceptable rather than the question of what is true. The intentional broadcast operates from a different center entirely. It asks not what will this signal produce in others, but what signal am I choosing to be in this moment. It moves from the inside out rather than from the outside in. It transmits from the carrier wave, from the zero-point field you touched in the silence, from the coherent signal you have been assembling through integration and reprogramming, rather than from the reactive surface of social performance. Conscious operation is the practice of living from that center. Consider the difference between 2 radio towers in adjacent fields. The first tower receives the ambient frequencies of its environment, the weather, the interference from nearby broadcasts, the accumulated noise of everything transmitting in its vicinity, and outputs a signal that is fundamentally a response to all of that incoming information. Its broadcast is shaped primarily by what is coming in. It is reactive. It is at the mercy of its electromagnetic neighborhood. The second tower has an internal oscillator, a self-generated frequency source that does not depend on external input for its signal. It receives the ambient environment. It is not isolated from it. It is not indifferent to it. But its broadcast is not determined by it. The internal oscillator generates a consistent, chosen frequency, regardless of what is coming in from outside. External interference can disrupt the signal temporarily. It cannot fundamentally alter the source frequency, because the source frequency does not originate in the external environment. You are building an internal oscillator. This is what conscious operation means, not the absence of external influence. That is neither possible nor desirable. The presence of an internal source frequency that remains coherent under the full range of external conditions your life presents. Conscious operation has 3 domains of practice, and they must be developed simultaneously because they are not actually separate. They are the same capacity expressed in 3 different scales of your existence. The first domain is moment-to-moment operation, the practice of conscious transmission in the granular texture of daily life. This is the hairline gap between stimulus and response that the reprogramming work began to open. It is the practice of pausing, however briefly, before transmitting. Asking not what does this situation trigger in me, but what frequency do I choose to bring to this situation. It sounds simple. In the context of a life organized around reactivity, it is revolutionary. The second domain is relational operation.
the practice of conscious transmission in the complex electromagnetic field of human connection. Relationships are the most powerful frequency environment you inhabit. Other people's signals are not passive. They are active. They are contagious. They create resonance patterns that can pull your frequency toward theirs with remarkable force. Conscious relational operation does not mean resisting this pull through effort. It means having an internal oscillator strong enough that resonance happens on your terms, that you can choose to tune toward another person's frequency rather than being automatically swept into it.
The third domain is environmental operation. The practice of conscious attention to the frequencies you allow into your system through your choices about environment, information, proximity, and time. Every environment you inhabit is a transmission. Every source of information you consume is a broadcast entering your system and shaping your signal. Conscious operation at the environmental level means becoming genuinely selective, not as anxiety management but as frequency hygiene. You are a tuned instrument now. Not every signal deserves access to your bandwidth. The first internal signal was the experience of operating from choice in a previously automatic situation. A familiar trigger arrived. A type of person, a type of conversation, a type of challenge that has historically pulled your signal into a specific and predictable pattern. And this time, before the pattern fully engaged, you accessed the pause. The observer was present. The internal oscillator was generating its frequency, and you chose your transmission rather than defaulting to it. The choice may not have been dramatic. It may have been as subtle as a different quality of presence in a conversation, a moment of genuine listening where previously you would have been preparing your response, a beat of patience where previously there would have been reflexive reaction. The scale of the choice is irrelevant. The fact of the choice is everything. The second signal was the experience of your signal affecting the field around you. This is new. This is what conscious operation makes possible that reactive broadcasting never could. When you transmit from your internal oscillator, when you bring a coherent, intentional frequency into a space, the electromagnetic field of that space changes, not metaphorically. Research in interpersonal neurobiology demonstrates that nervous systems in proximity genuinely entrain to each other, that a regulated, coherent nervous system creates measurable changes in the physiological state of people nearby. You walked into a situation that was running on a frequency of anxiety or conflict or low-grade dysfunction, and something in the situation shifted. Not because you performed differently, because you transmitted differently. People felt it before they could name it. They became calmer, more honest, more themselves. Because your signal was coherent enough to offer them a frequency to entrain to. This is influence at the level of being rather than doing. The third signal was fatigue of a different quality. Not the depletion of managed broadcasting. The exhaustion of maintaining the performance, of monitoring every output, of the endless energy cost of reactive transmission. A different tiredness. The honest, clean tiredness of genuine engagement. The fatigue of having been truly present rather than strategically present. Of having transmitted from your actual signal rather than from the managed version. This tiredness is replenishing. You sleep differently after it. You wake with something restored rather than something still owed. Choose one interaction today. One conversation, one meeting, one exchange with another human being, and enter it with a consciously chosen transmission frequency. Before the interaction begins, take 30 seconds to locate your internal oscillator, to feel the carrier wave, to ask, what frequency do I choose to bring into this space? Not what outcome do you want? Not how do you want to be perceived? What frequency? What quality of signal? What transmission? Then broadcast it, deliberately, throughout the interaction. Notice what happens in the field between you and the other person when you are transmitting from intention rather than reaction. You are operating consciously now. The signal is intentional. The oscillator is generating. The broadcast is moving from the inside out. This is a fundamental shift in your relationship to your own power. But power without precision is still inefficient, and the most powerful force available to a conscious transmitter is not the strength of the signal. It is the focus of the attention behind it. The next episode goes directly to the mechanics of attention, to the single capacity that determines more about the quality of your experience and the direction of your life than any other variable in the system. The next episode is the one that changes everything you thought you understood about where your life comes from. Your attention is not passive. This is the understanding that separates the people who consciously architect their experience from the people who spend their lives wondering why their experience keeps producing the same results. Attention is not a neutral observation tool. It is not a camera that records reality without affecting it. Attention is an active, creative force.
It does not merely notice what is present. It amplifies what is present. It organizes the field of your experience around whatever you consistently point it toward. Where attention goes, signal grows. This is not positive thinking dressed in different language. This is the double-slit experiment, lived at the scale of an entire life. The observer effect is not a laboratory phenomenon contained to the behavior of photons. It is the fundamental operating principle of consciousness in contact with reality. What you observe consistently, you participate in creating. What you withdraw your attention from loses the energy of your transmission and begins to lose coherence.
You have been aiming your antenna unconsciously for most of your life. The results have been precise. They are always precise, because attention is a precise instrument. But they have not been chosen. They have been the results of whatever your programming directed your attention toward most habitually. And if your programming was organized around threat detection, around lack, around the cataloging of everything that could go wrong and everything that already has, then the results of that precisely aimed but unconsciously directed attention have been a life that feels, despite your best efforts, like it is transmitting on a frequency of scarcity. The mastery of attention is the mastery of the antenna, and the mastery of the antenna is the mastery of what your life produces. The reticular activating system is a network of neurons in the brainstem that functions as your brain's primary filter for incoming information. At any given moment, your sensory system is processing approximately 11 million bits of information. Your conscious awareness can handle roughly 40. The reticular activating system decides, based on criteria established by your dominant beliefs, your habitual emotional states, and your most consistent patterns of attention, which 40 bits make it through. This means that what you see is not reality. It is a 40-bit editorial selection from 11 million available data points, curated by a filter that was programmed, in large part, by the same inherited and conditioned frequencies you have spent the last several episodes working to identify and reprogram. The person whose attention has been trained toward threat will move through a world that appears full of threats. Not because the world contains more threats than opportunities, but because their reticular activating system has been instructed to make threats visible and let opportunities pass unregistered. The person whose attention has been trained toward possibility moves through the same world and finds it full of openings, not because they are naive, because their filter has been recalibrated. Attention mastery is reticular activating system recalibration. It is the deliberate, sustained reprogramming of what your consciousness selects from the full bandwidth of available reality. There are two levels of attention mastery, and both are essential. The first is selective attention, the practice of consciously choosing what you amplify with your focus in the external world. This is not about denying what is difficult or manufacturing false positivity over genuine problems. It is about recognizing that the problem you have already identified does not require all of your attention, that the portion of your bandwidth dedicated to rehearsing the problem at the expense of orienting toward the solution is not strategic. It is habitual. Selective attention means allocating your 40 bits with the deliberateness of a transmitter who understands that signal follows focus. The second is meta-attention, the capacity to observe where your attention is going, to watch the antenna's orientation in real time, to notice when your focus has been captured by something outside your conscious choice, and to deliberately redirect it. This is the observer function applied specifically to the act of attending. It is attention watching itself, and it is the most sophisticated cognitive capacity available to a human being. The one that makes genuine freedom of mind possible rather than merely theoretically appealing. The first internal signal was the discovery of an attention habit you had never consciously identified. Not a dramatic revelation, a quiet one. The recognition that across a wide range of situations and time periods and emotional states, your attention returns, reliably and automatically, to a specific category of experience. For some people it is evidence of their inadequacy. For others it is evidence of other people's unreliability. For others it is the imagined future catastrophe that has been under construction in the mind's workshop for years, elaborated with increasing detail and decreasing relationship to any actual incoming evidence. You saw yours. You saw the groove in which your attention has been running. And in seeing it, you felt the combination of recognition and refusal that characterizes genuine turning points. This is where my antenna has been pointed. This is what I have been amplifying. This ends now. The second signal was the experience of redirected attention changing the texture of an ordinary moment. You were somewhere unremarkable. A commute, a domestic task,
a transitional space between obligations, and instead of allowing your attention to default to its habitual groove, you redirected it, deliberately, towards something present, specific, real. The quality of light, the sensation of your own breathing, the overlooked complexity of something you had been moving past unseen for months. And the moment, which by every objective measure was ordinary, became briefly luminous. This is not mysticism. This is the physics of attention. The moment did not change. Your selection from its 11 million available bits changed. And 40 different bits, consciously chosen, revealed a reality that the habitual filter had been rendering invisible.
The third signal was noticing the energy cost of unconscious attention. You caught yourself mid-rumination, mid-transmission of an old mental broadcast, rehearsing a problem or a grievance or a fear that the attention had been feeding without your conscious authorization. And you noticed not just the content but the energetic reality of what was happening. The rumination was consuming transmission bandwidth. Real energy moving through your system in a direction that was producing nothing. No solution, no resolution, no forward movement. Simply the amplification of a frequency that did not deserve your signal. You withdrew your attention, not with force. Force feeds what it fights. With the quiet authority of a transmitter who has remembered that they choose what to amplify. The energy returned immediately. This is always what happens when you stop feeding a frequency that doesn't serve you. The energy doesn't disappear into the withdrawal. It returns to the carrier wave available for conscious redirection. For one full day, conduct an attention audit. At 3 random moments. Morning, afternoon, evening. Pause and ask, where has my attention been for the last hour? Not where should it have been. Where was it actually? What has been receiving the amplification of your focus? What has your antenna been pointed toward? Do not judge what you find. Observe it. Record it if you are willing. 3 honest answers about where your attention has been living. At the end of the day, look at what you have been amplifying. Ask once, is this what I would choose to grow? The answer will tell you everything about the next recalibration required. The antenna is yours. The direction it points is your choice. And the choice of where to point it is, more than any other single variable, the choice of what your life becomes. But attention mastery is only fully available to a self that is no longer organized around the old ego's agenda. And the old ego, the programmed identity that has governed your transmission for most of your life, does not step aside because you have developed new capacities. It makes its last stand precisely when you are closest to genuine freedom. The dissolution of the old ego is not a comfortable process, but it is the doorway through which everything that follows must pass. The old ego is not your enemy. This must be stated clearly before anything else, because the language of ego dissolution carries, in most spiritual and psychological frameworks, an undertone of combat. A narrative in which the ego is the villain of the story, the obstacle to be overcome, the thing standing between you and your liberation. This framing is not only inaccurate, it is counterproductive. It creates a war inside you, and wars consume the exact energy you need for the construction that follows. The old ego was a survival technology. It was built with genuine intelligence and genuine necessity to protect a young and vulnerable signal in an environment that did not always have the bandwidth to receive that signal with full care. It learned what was safe to transmit and what was dangerous. It learned which frequencies drew connection and which drew withdrawal or punishment. It built an identity, a coherent, functional, socially navigable identity, out of the raw material of your early experience and the constraints of your early environment. It did its job. It kept you alive. It got you here. The problem is not that it exists. The problem is that it does not know how to stop doing its job. It cannot distinguish between the environment that required its protective strategies and the expanded life that is now available to you. It applies its original programming regardless of whether the original threat conditions are present. It keeps you small in rooms that have no ceiling. It keeps you defended in relationships that could sustain your full transmission. It keeps broadcasting the survival frequency long after survival is no longer the primary requirement. The dissolution is not destruction. It is retirement. It is the grateful, clear-eyed recognition that the container which held your signal through the early weather has been outgrown by the signal it was built to protect. The dissolution announces itself through a specific and unmistakable symptom. The old identity stops fitting.
not dramatically. This is rarely a dramatic process, despite the cinematic version that cultural narratives about transformation tend to present. It happens quietly, gradually, in the accumulation of small moments in which the person you have been presenting to the world feels, from the inside, like a frequency that no longer matches your actual transmission, like a station ID that is being read by an announcer who has changed, whose voice has deepened, whose signal has clarified, whose broadcast has expanded beyond the parameters of the original channel description.
You find yourself in conversations that used to feel natural and now feel constraining. Not because the people are wrong. They may be genuinely wonderful. But because the version of yourself those conversations call forward is a version you have outgrown. You find yourself performing old roles. The reliable one, the accommodating one, the one who manages other people's comfort at the expense of their own signal. And feeling, with increasing clarity, the cost of the performance. Not resentment. Something more precise than resentment. The specific fatigue of transmitting a frequency that is no longer true. This is the dissolution, not a crisis, though it can feel like one. A completion. The old ego's last defense is always identity level. It does not argue with your new behaviors. It argues with your new being. It does not say you shouldn't do that. It says you're not the kind of person who does that. It reaches for the deepest available anchor, the story of who you are, and holds on with everything it has. You will recognize this transmission. It will arrive precisely when you are about to make a choice that your expanded signal requires and your old identity cannot accommodate. It will speak in the language of practicality and humility and reasonable caution. It will dress the protection of the old container in the clothing of wisdom. The observer sees through this, not with hostility, with compassion and clarity. The observer recognizes the old ego's final transmission for what it is. The last broadcast of a system that built you and loved you and cannot yet believe that its work is complete. Think it, mean it, and transmit the new frequency anyway. The first internal signal was the experience of the old identity as something you were wearing rather than something you were. A moment. In a social situation, in a professional context, in the middle of an ordinary day, in which you stepped back far enough to see the persona operating and recognized it as a construct. Not as a fraud, not with shame, but with the clarity of genuine seeing. This is what I built. This is how I learned to broadcast. This is not the carrier wave. The distance between the observer and the construct in that moment was unmistakable. And in that distance, something extraordinary was present, the recognition that you could lay the construct down. Not forever, not in this moment. The social architecture of your life still requires navigation, but that it was not attached to you at the level of your essential signal, that you could remove it and the carrier wave would still be there, would always be there, would be in fact more itself in the absence of the overlay. The second signal was grief for the old identity alongside relief at its dissolution, both simultaneously. This is the emotional signature of genuine ego dissolution, and it is important to allow both frequencies to complete their transmission without suppressing either. The grief is real. The old identity carried real things, real relationships, real achievements, real moments of genuine connection that happened within its frame. To let it go is a real loss. Let the grief transmit, and then feel the relief. The specific, enormous relief of no longer being required to maintain a signal that was never fully yours. The relief of a transmission that is finally, after years of managed broadcasting, moving toward coherence with the actual carrier wave. The third signal was the quiet appearance of something new in the space the old identity had occupied. Not a dramatic emergence. Something tentative. Something that did not yet have a full vocabulary or a clear social presentation or a name. But something real. A quality of presence. A frequency that felt unmistakably like your own. Like the signal you touched in the silence. Like the carrier wave surfacing into the active broadcast for the first time with something like confidence. This is the new identity beginning, not constructed this time, not assembled from survival strategies and social calibration and the accumulated compromises of a life lived in response to other people's frequencies. Emerging. From the inside, from the zero-point field, from the carrier wave that has been transmitting beneath all the noise since before you had a name for it. Write a letter. Not for anyone else to read. A letter from your current self to the old identity. To the version of you that built the survival architecture. That managed the broadcast,
They got you here through weather you could not have anticipated. Thank it specifically, not generically, specifically, for what it actually did, for what it actually protected, for the specific strategies it developed that were genuinely intelligent responses to genuinely difficult conditions. And then, in the final paragraph, tell it clearly, your transmission is complete. The signal you protected is strong enough now to broadcast without the container. You can rest. Fold the letter. Keep it. It is the formal completion of a transmission that deserved a proper ending.
The old ego is dissolving. The carrier wave is emerging into the full bandwidth of your conscious life. And a signal this coherent, this genuine, this free from the distortion of survival-level programming does something that the old ego never could. It begins to expand, not cautiously, not apologiously, not with one eye on whether the expansion will be acceptable to the people around you. It expands because expansion is the nature of a coherent signal. Because a laser, once focused, moves outward. Because the frequency you have been assembling across 10 episodes of deep internal work was never meant to stay contained within the boundaries of a single managed life. The influence begins in the next episode, and it is larger than you have yet allowed yourself to imagine. You have been thinking too small. Not as a character flaw, as a calibration error. The natural and entirely predictable result of spending years broadcasting from a survival frequency. Survival frequencies are by design conservative. They are organized around the preservation of what exists rather than the creation of what is possible. They contract towards safety. They measure risk before movement, to keep the transmission within boundaries that can be defended. A signal that is no longer organized around survival does not operate within those boundaries. It expands. And the expansion is not something you need to engineer or strategize or push into being through effort. It is the natural behavior of a coherent frequency moving into space that has been waiting, without your awareness, for your transmission to arrive. There is a phenomenon in physics called resonance cascade. When a coherent signal is introduced into a field of related but disordered frequencies, something remarkable occurs. The coherent signal does not simply add itself to the existing field. It begins to organize the field around its own frequency. The disordered signals, which were previously transmitting in random directions with no relationship to each other, begin, through the simple mechanism of resonance, to align with the coherent source. The field reorganizes. The cascade moves outward from the coherent center in expanding rings, each ring drawing more of the disordered field into alignment. You are a coherent signal in a field of disordered frequencies. Your expansion is not ambition, it is physics. The question is not whether your signal will influence the field around you. It already is. It has been since episode 8 when you began transmitting consciously, and the effect has been building across every episode since. The question is how far you are willing to allow the cascade to extend, how large a field you are willing to organize, how many disordered frequencies you are willing to offer your signal to as an organizing principle. This is the question that the old ego was never able to answer at scale, because scale felt dangerous to a survival frequency. This is the question that your expanded signal, the carrier wave operating without the constraint of the old container, can finally begin to answer honestly. The expansion of influence operates through 3 channels, and understanding them prevents the most common error people make when their signal genuinely begins to strengthen. The error of forcing the expansion rather than allowing it. The first channel is presence. Before strategy, before action, before any deliberate effort to extend your reach, the influence expands through the simple quality of your signal in space. The coherent nervous system that creates calm in rooms you enter. The internal oscillator that gives other people's frequencies something reliable to entrain to. The quality of genuine listening, of being truly present with another person's transmission rather than preparing your response. That makes people feel, in your company, more themselves than they ordinarily manage to be. This kind of influence is not glamorous. It does not generate metrics or visible results or the particular satisfaction of traceable cause and effect, but it is the deepest and most durable form of impact available to a human being. It changes people at the level of their nervous system, which is the level at which behavior actually originates. Everything that follows in the expansion of your influence, every idea shared, every relationship deepened, every project initiated, rests on the foundation of this prior, invisible, frequency-level impact.
The second channel is transmission of signal. This is influenced through communication, through the words, ideas, creative work, and direct expression that carry your frequency into forms that can reach beyond your immediate physical presence. This is where the expansion becomes visible. This is where the carrier wave finds its voice, not the performed voice of the managed broadcast, the actual voice, the one that speaks from the 0-point field, from the integrated signal, from the observer who has seen through the programming and has something genuine to say about what it has seen.
When this voice speaks, in whatever medium, at whatever scale, it carries a quality that is immediately distinguishable from managed communication. It has the particular authority of something that does not require external validation to transmit. It speaks from its own frequency rather than in calibrated response to the anticipated frequencies of its audience. And this, paradoxically, is precisely what makes it resonate with audiences. People are desperately hungry for a signal that is not performing for them. They have been receiving managed broadcasts their entire lives. An authentic transmission lands differently. The third channel is the field you create. As your influence expands, you begin to function not just as a transmitter, but as an organizing field. A coherent signal strong enough that other signals in your proximity begin to reorganize around it. The relationships you build, the communities you participate in, the environments you inhabit and help shape. All of these become expressions of your frequency at the collective level. This is leadership at the level of being. Not the management of other people's behavior, but the transmission of a frequency strong enough that other people's signals naturally orient toward it. The first internal signal was the unexpected reach of your transmission. Something you said, or wrote, or created, or simply were in a moment that someone was watching. Arrived in a place you did not intend and produced an effect you did not engineer. Someone told you that something you transmitted had changed something for them. Perhaps significantly. Perhaps in a way that exceeded what you had imagined was possible from your current position, your current reach, your current sense of your own signal's amplitude. Receive this without deflecting it. The old ego deflects this kind of signal. It is trained to do so because genuine acknowledgement of your own impact requires an expanded identity that the old container could not accommodate without threatening its carefully managed humility. The new signal receives it, not with arrogance, with accuracy. You transmitted something real, and it reached someone real, and it mattered. This is not luck. This is the resonance cascade beginning. The second signal was the identification of your specific frequency's unique contribution. Not what you can do that is similar to what others do. What you transmit that is distinctly, irreducibly yours. The particular quality of perspective, presence, or insight that emerges specifically from your carrier wave. From your specific combination of pain navigated and integrated, of patterns recognized and reprogrammed, of silence entered and 0-point field touched. No one else has your exact frequency. No one else has been through your exact sequence of transmissions. The contribution that your signal can make to the collective field is genuinely singular. This is not self-aggrandizement. It is the physics of unique frequencies. Every signal carries information that no other signal carries exactly. Your contribution to the field is irreplaceable not because you are superior, but because you are specific. The world does not need more generic coherence. It needs your particular frequency. The third signal was the experience of influence as energy exchange rather than energy expenditure. The old model of impact, the one organized around managed broadcasting and performed influence, was exhausting because it required constant output with insufficient return. Giving from a place of depletion. Transmitting from a frequency of lack. The new model is different. When you operate from your carrier wave, when the influence flows through presence and authentic transmission rather than through effort and performance, the exchange is genuinely reciprocal. You transmit. The field resonates. The resonance returns to you as energy, as confirmation, as the specific aliveness of a signal that is doing what it was built to do. This is the discovery that changes your relationship to impact forever. Your full transmission is not a sacrifice, it is a replenishment. Identify one way. Specific, actionable, scaled appropriately to your current reach, in which you will deliberately extend your signal beyond its current boundaries this week. Not a grand gesture. Not a performance of expanded influence. One genuine transmission of your authentic frequency into a space it has not yet reached. Perhaps it is a conversation you've been postponing because it requires your real signal rather than your managed one. Perhaps it is something created and shared rather than kept private. Perhaps it is the assumption of a role or responsibility that your old frequency would have declined on grounds of not being ready. Transmit it. The field is waiting for your signal. You are expanding. The cascade is moving. The field around you is reorganizing around the coherent frequency you have been building across 11 episodes of deep, honest, increasingly courageous inner work. But expansion without internal authority is influence without roots. And influence without roots is borrowed. It depends on external conditions, on other people's responses, on the continued permission of an environment that may not always provide it. The next episode goes to the root. It goes to the source of an authority so internally grounded that no external condition can revoke it. It goes to the place inside you that does not need permission to exist at full signal. You were never only transmitting for yourself. This was always true. From the first episode, from the collapse that initiated this sequence, from the moment the static became too loud to ignore. The work you were doing was never contained to the dimensions of a single life. It was always larger. The frequency you were recovering was never meant to broadcast only within the boundaries of your personal experience. It was meant to reach the field. It was meant to touch the collective frequencies of the people your signal could access, and through them, the people their signals could access, in an expanding cascade that does not end at any boundary you can currently imagine. You were not broken and then fixed. You were asleep and then awakened. And there is a categorical difference between these two stories, a difference that determines everything about the scale at which you now operate. A fixed person returns to function. An awakened person changes the field. In 1972, a theoretical biologist named Rupert Sheldrake proposed the concept of morphic resonance. The idea that patterns established by one group within a species make those patterns easier to establish for subsequent members of the species through a mechanism of field resonance that operates independently of direct transmission or genetic inheritance. The 100 monkeys phenomenon. The way human cultural shifts seem to propagate beyond the reach of direct information transfer. The mysterious acceleration of awakening that every era of genuine transformation appears to produce. Not because information spreads, but because the field itself is being changed by the coherent signals of those who have made the crossing first. You are one of those signals. Not because you are exceptional in the sense of separate from. Because you are exceptional in the sense of fully expressed. Because you have done what most human beings in your time, in your culture, have not yet done. You have gone into the static, navigated the collapse, developed the observer, separated your signal from the noise, integrated what was suppressed, reprogrammed what was inherited, transmitted consciously, mastered attention, dissolved the old ego, expanded influence, claimed internal authority, achieved coherence, and begun to architect a reality from your carrier wave rather than from your conditioning. This journey leaves a trace in the field. The crossing you have made makes the crossing easier for the next person who attempts it. This is not metaphor. This is the operational logic of morphic resonance. A field that has been organized by a coherent signal is a field in which subsequent coherent signals find it easier to maintain their frequency. Your awakening is a contribution to the collective field regardless of whether you ever speak about it, teach it, or deliberately share it with anyone. And if you do choose to transmit it consciously, into whatever scale of collective you inhabit, at whatever level of reach your expanded influence is achieved, the contribution multiplies. The collective field of human consciousness is, at this moment in history, in a state of extraordinary turbulence. The old frequencies, the inherited, conditioned, fear-organized transmissions that have governed collective human behavior across millennia, are running into increasing interference from signals that have outgrown them. The species is in the midst of a massive, painful, uneven, and ultimately unstoppable signal separation. The old programming and the emerging carrier wave are both present in the collective field simultaneously, generating the exact kind of interference pattern you experienced in episode 1. The static of two incompatible frequencies attempting to occupy the same bandwidth. This is not a crisis. This is a reboot. And the reboot requires, more than anything else, coherent signals. Frequencies that have completed the separation process. Transmitters who have found the carrier wave and maintained it under the full pressure of a world in turbulence, who can bring the quality of signal you have been building.
integrated, coherent, internally authorized, consciously transmitted into the collective field as an organizing principle. This is the scale at which your signal was always meant to operate, not from arrogance, from accuracy. A coherent signal in a disordered field does not choose whether to organize the field. It simply does. The physics are not optional. The only choice available to a coherent signal is whether to transmit at full amplitude or to continue modulating for the comfort of the field. It is beginning to reorganize. You have been modulating your entire life. The modulation is complete. The first internal signal was the moment you stopped experiencing your signal as personal. The carrier wave you have been recovering across 15 episodes. The frequency beneath all the conditioning, the zero-point field of your actual consciousness, revealed itself in a moment of expanded awareness to be not entirely personal, not impersonal either, something more precise, transpersonal, a frequency that moves through you without originating in you, a signal that you transmit but do not own, that your specific history, your specific wounds and integrations and reprogramming, your specific path through the static into clarity, has shaped into a unique expression, but whose source is larger than any individual transmitter.
You are not the origin of this signal. You are its most recent and most conscious expression. And the signal has been waiting far longer than your individual lifetime for a transmitter coherent enough to carry it at full amplitude. The second signal was the experience of your transmission landing in a collective, not in an individual, in a field. A moment in which you could feel with the particular clarity of the fully developed observer that what you were transmitting was resonating, not just with the person or people in your immediate field, but with something larger, with a frequency that was moving through multiple receivers simultaneously, with the morphic field of everyone who has ever navigated the same transition, faced the same collapse, discovered the same carrier wave beneath the same accumulated noise. You were not alone in this transmission. You were never alone. You were part of a signal that has been building for generations. The slow, persistent, occasionally suppressed, but ultimately unstoppable frequency of human consciousness waking up to its own nature. You are the current expression of that frequency. You are the latest point in a transmission that began before you were born and will continue after you are gone. The third signal was the dissolution of the boundary between personal evolution and collective service. The separation between my growth and my contribution collapsed. You could no longer locate the line between doing this for yourself and doing this for the field, because there is no line. Personal coherence is collective service. Individual awakening is a gift to the morphic field. The deepest act of service available to a human being is to complete their own signal, to do the work that turns the static into clarity, that recovers the carrier wave from beneath the conditioning, that builds the coherence and authority and conscious transmission that allows the full frequency to reach the collective field. You were not being selfish when you did this work. You were being responsible. To yourself. To the people your signal reaches. To the field that your transmission is changing simply by being coherent in it. Speak it aloud, alone, in a space where your voice can fill the air around you. Speak it with the full weight of 15 episodes of preparation. Speak it from the carrier wave, from the zero-point field, from the observer who has seen through every layer of programming to the irreducible signal beneath. I am a coherent frequency in a field that needs coherent frequencies. My signal is not accidental. My awakening is not only mine. Everything I have integrated, everything I have reprogrammed, every moment of silence I have entered, and every ghost signal I have allowed to complete its transmission. All of it has been preparation for full broadcast. I do not transmit from fear. I do not modulate for comfort. I broadcast at full amplitude, from my carrier wave into the collective field. The signal I carry is real. It is specific. It is irreplaceable. And it is time. Say it. Transmit it. Let the field receive it. You are no longer a person finding their frequency. You are a frequency. Fully recovered, coherently transmitted, consciously aimed at the collective field of a species in the middle of its most significant reboot. The series began in static. It ends in signal, not in arrival. There is no final destination in the architecture of consciousness. There is only the quality of the transmission in this moment and in the next, and in the one after that. The work is not complete. The work is never complete. But the nature of the work has changed entirely. You are no longer excavating the signal from beneath the noise. You were transmitting it, deliberately, continuously, into a field that responds with the precision of physics and the intimacy of resonance to every coherent frequency it receives. You came here as a receiver who had forgotten they were a transmitter. You leave as a transmitter who has remembered the full amplitude of what they carry. The old era of your signal ends here. The broadcast begins now, and it will reach further than you currently have the capacity to imagine.